Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. It is nice to see you all here. We have a tremendous contingent from CETIS University. How many from CETIS University here? Wow. Oh, excellent. Thank you for joining us. Today we are really happy because we have a speaker that will be talking about the integration of the three countries in North America. But before I introduce formally the speaker, I would like to thank the Allers Center for International Business for sponsoring and organizing this event. Dr. Denise Diamond and her team are here, and we're really thanking her and her team because organizing events of this nature implies a lot of logistics. So thank you also to CETIS University for coming and joining us. My name is Jaime Gomez, and I am the Dean of the School of Business at the University of San Diego here. And 25 years ago, I actually was part of the NAFTA 1.0. That was the beginning of the integration of the three countries. In that particular time, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have Twitter, and we didn't have many other things. So the speed of change is tremendous, and that's exactly why NAFTA 1.0 had to be modernized, because many things have changed. Now we have a new US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and the idea is that through commerce, through trade, the three countries will be better off. In fact, here in the University of San Diego, we really believe in peace and prosperity through commerce. We have a Center for Peace and Commerce. So we really believe that trade, business activities can actually bring a lot of prosperity, social well-being, and many other positive things. And tonight we have actually a person who really understands the dynamics of the, of the integration of the three countries. Guillermo Malpica Soto has been the head of the Trade and NAFTA Office in Washington, and he belongs, or he's working with the Ministry of Economy in Washington, D.C. He has been working for more than 20 years in trade-related activities, not only in North America, but around the world. And Guillermo enjoys a very holistic understanding of trade activities around the world. Tonight, he will be sharing with us in about 20-25 minutes major highlights about NAFTA 2.0 or the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Guillermo has degrees in economics and international relations. He's also a professor at Monterrey Tech. But we want to listen from him as opposed to me introducing him. Guillermo, welcome. Please come on in.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much to all of you for your presence. I will share with you some elements of the negotiation from the point of view of the Mexican government, of this very challenging and very complex negotiation, probably the most challenging negotiation from Mexico during the entire history of negotiating FTAs. More than 25 years. And I would like to go relatively quickly through the slides. I have many slides that I will leave for you to explore in detail. But I would like to have more time to exchange views and answer your questions, if you agree. Because I believe that it's more useful to have this exchange of views than just having me talking about what I have in my slides. So I will welcome all your comments and your questions after my presentation. So first of all, a few data about the relation, the trade and investment relation, and about the history of Mexico as an economy integrated in the global markets. After the negotiation of NAFTA and the entry of Mexico to the multilateral system, at that time the GATT and now the WTO, we engaged in an exercise of negotiating free trade agreements, trying to liberalize also the economy. And so we started participating in the global value chains since the beginning of the 90s. Today, the results are that the ones that you see in the slide. We are one of the main importers and exporters of the world. In terms of investment, we have also been able to move from an average of around $4 billion US every year in the pre-NAFTA years to more than $30 billion US a year the last, as an average in the last 5 years. So we are very important recipients of foreign direct investment in the region, and that is also because we have a strong set of provisions to protect investments through these agreements and through the bilateral investment agreements that Mexico negotiates. We have now a network of free trade agreements, 13 FTAs with 50 countries. And that account for more than 1 billion of consumers that Mexico has as potential customers and enjoying preferential treatment for their goods and services. We have a globalized view on how we should be developing our trade strategy, not only the modernization of the USMCA or the NAFTA 2.0, as I like to call it, but also working very hard in other regions of the world, because there are other regions that are more also important and competitive, and we need to be part of those. So we were part of the CPTPP on the TPP, and then the CPTPP, which is even harder to pronounce. And now we are working as also we had an exercise of integration after a number of years that we were negotiating FTAs individually. Then we decided in a second phase of the negotiations to start negotiating like blocks of FTAs, trying to consolidate different FTAs into single FTAs. For instance, we had 3 free trade agreements with Central American countries, and we negotiated after that a single Central American FTA. And then we had individual agreements with, we had an agreement with Colombia and Venezuela. Venezuela left that agreement, the G3, it was called. We had an individual agreement with Peru, an individual agreement with Chile, and we negotiated after a number of years Pacific Alliance among the four countries, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia. And we are engaging in this type of exercises. In terms of Latin America, we are approaching our colleagues from South America, Argentina, and Brazil. We already have an agreement with Uruguay. And we had suspended negotiations with Turkey and Jordan. Maybe we will re-engage in negotiations with Turkey. It's something that is in the potential pipeline. And of course, during the negotiation of the new NAFTA, we were negotiating also a modernization of the agreement with the European Union, which is important. And I think that negotiation in parallel had effects in the results of the negotiation of the EU agreement and in the NAFTA, on the new NAFTA agreement. Together, and we like to see, in Mexico, we like to see this exercise of negotiation as a regional experience. Together, North America represents a population of 490 million people and combined trade of $1 trillion US. Talking about the bilateral relation, trade between Mexico and the US has grown 7 times since NAFTA entered into force. And now Mexico, alone with the US, has more trade than the countries, the blocks that you see in that part of the slide, with the BRICS, with some important European countries and some important Asian countries. So there's an important flow of goods and services, but more importantly than that, after 25 years of trade, we are now a more integrated region. We no longer export or import goods alone, but we produce together. No? We have an integrated production. And you can see in the first part of this slide that for each dollar that Mexico exports to the US, 40 cents is composed by inputs that Mexico imported from the US before. So that tells you about the level of integration. That level of integration is 25% in the case of Canada, Canada-US, and in the case of China-US is 10%. So we have an intertwined production process, and we believe that is a good way to compete as a bloc, as a region with other regions of the world. we have seen also throughout the history of NAFTA that there is a diversification of our exports, and that has been mentioned several times by many studies. I'm going to skip part of these charts, and I want to focus more on the negotiation of the new NAFTA, because that's what I wanted to explain to you a little bit in detail. So I will skip these slides. Well, this is important. Just let me mention that in terms of jobs, trade with Mexico and Canada represents 11 million jobs in the U.S. In terms of trade with Mexico, trade between Mexico and the U.S. creates 5 million jobs in the U.S. So it is an important number. You can see that those figures state by state. In some states it's more important, especially in the border states. But in general terms, I think we have a very important contribution to job creation in the U.S. So that is contrary to the new argument that we have been listening, that trade with Mexico and Canada takes jobs from the U.S. No, that is a different explanation of what is happening. In terms of investment, I won't stop much. I already told you the importance of the growing investment inflows that we are having, and now we're seeing a different trend in terms of the investment in Mexico. We have for several years now been net exporters of investment. We not only receive a lot of foreign direct investment, but also more and more Mexican companies are investing outside of Mexico. In the case of the U.S., we have 73 billion US dollars of investment from Mexico in many companies, and we calculate. It's difficult to calculate because we don't have very accurate numbers in this particular variable, but we contribute more or less with 120,000 jobs in the U.S. through investments from Mexican companies in the U.S. So what about the process of negotiation? We were, let me start by saying that Mexico was not intending to renegotiate the NAFTA, and that is not a surprise. We believed the NAFTA, when it was negotiated at the end of 1992, and entered into force at the beginning of 1994, had a number of very delicate balances to be agreed. So we were fearing that renegotiating the agreement would open all these texts and create imbalances and create a noise that we didn't want to have. So we were not particularly favorable to renegotiate NAFTA, and we believed that a good opportunity to modernize provisions between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., among other countries, was through the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This agreement among 12 countries that included countries in Latin America, the North American countries, and countries in Asia Pacific. We were successful in negotiating an agreement after 5 years in the case of the original negotiators, and in the case of Mexico, after 3 years of entering into the negotiations. And it was the best agreement. We were very happy. It was, we had 2 years left of the last administration, and we thought it was going to be a relaxed time just to write the book about the TPP and to start enjoying the new agreement, the best agreement in 20 years. No? What happened then is that we had a change of administration in the US, and the first decision of the current administration was to withdraw from the TPP. No? So in that scenario, it made all the sense to start thinking about a modernization of the agreement. Not a renegotiation, a modernization is what we wanted to do. This is a timeline of the negotiation. There were many very controversial issues in the negotiation that I can explain if you wish in the Q&A session. But basically, as opposed to the original negotiation of NAFTA 2.0 negotiation was different in many senses. The first is that the three countries were not seeking the same. Mexico and Canada were seeking to improve the provisions of the current NAFTA, modernized agreement, and in the case of the US, there was an additional interest of rebalancing trade. No, there was this concern on the deficits, on the trade deficits, and they wanted to fix that through renegotiation. So that was complicated to start with, and then we had during the fourth round of negotiation a number of proposals by the US that were very complicated to digest by Mexico and by Canada, and we were starting to think how to solve these contentious issues that were called by the private sector in the US what was the name? The poison pills. The poison pills they were mentioning. We had a number of proposals in that regard, referring to dispute settlement, to the way the agreement should end, that the famous sunset clause. There was an interest in having a seasonality provision to incorporate investigations, anti-dumping investigations on agricultural products. So there were a number of very complicated proposals, and we decided that we needed to tackle them in a very different manner. But before going to these very specific topics, let me tell you that let me go to this slide, which is my favorite. Mexico decided to approach this exercise with 4 priorities in mind. First of all, and you can see those 4 priorities. First of all, to increase regional competitiveness for us. This exercise is regional. It's not for Mexico, but it's for the region. So we need to have provisions to enhance competitiveness of North America. And in that case, we needed to guarantee the preferential access to goods and services. We need to work on the second generation of obstacles after you have a tariff-free environment, which is basically the difference of regulations among countries. No? Once you don't pay tariffs, the second generation of obstacles is that you have to comply with very different regulations if you want to export to Canada and if you want to export to the US. So that was a problem that we wanted to solve in the negotiation of this USMCA. And we have a very interesting chapter on good regulatory practices that basically aims at solving that problem. Additionally, we have 9 sectoral annexes for very different sectors where the private sector was interested in the 3 countries to coordinate regionally in order to improve consistency of regulations of those sectors. So it's a very interesting exercise among other chapters that you see around this circle of regional competitiveness. Second priority for Mexico, to modernize. No? After 25 years, and Jaime was mentioning this, many provisions were obsolete. We needed to improve those. And in that sense, we have now a new chapter on digital trade. We have a new chapter on labor and environment. We have a new chapter on anti-corruption. We have a new chapter on competitiveness. You can see. Let me go back just to the list of chapters. In the original NAFTA, we had 22 chapters. Now we have 34 chapters. So we're basically creating new chapters for the new topics, and additionally, we are improving the provisions of several of the chapters. For instance, the chapter on telecommunications is very different because the reality of telecommunications in the 90s and the reality of telecommunications now is very different. The same happens with the financial services chapter and other chapters of the agreement. Let me go back to the priorities. A third priority was to make an agreement more inclusive and more responsible. That was bringing the topics of the new topics of the international discussion to the body of the negotiation. No? And we have labor and environment in the original NAFTA, where side agreements were not part of the agreement. And as side agreements, they were not subject to dispute settlement. So in other words, if a country didn't comply with the provisions in those side agreements, there were no consequences. No? These provisions had no teeth, to put it simple. Now these are chapters of the new NAFTA, and they are subject to dispute settlement if there is not a compliance on one of the provisions by one of the parties, and that is important in terms of this provision. I can talk more about those provisions, and I will talk a little bit about labor when I refer to the process of ratification. of this agreement. And finally, the fourth priority for Mexico was to increase legal certainty. No? We had this in the original NAFTA. We have 3 chapters related to dispute settlement. One is the original NAFTA Chapter 11 for investor-state dispute settlement. That is when a foreign investor has a problem in the country where it's established. There's a mechanism to solve that dispute. Chapter 20, it's the same, but for disputes among states. And Chapter 19 is for disputes related to trade remedies, related to anti-dumping investigations, for instance. So we have these 3 chapters, and our intention was to improve those chapters to provide more legal certainty to the users of the agreement. And at the end, we were able to have some success in improving some of them, or keeping at the end of the day some of them. It was by no means a simple task, because in the case of the U.S., for instance, they didn't want Chapter 19, they didn't want to improve Chapter 20, and they were very happy not having a Chapter 11. No? Although it was, although the U.S. investors are the main users of Chapter 11 on investor-state disputes. So we had to work with those positions, and at the end of the day, we have, I think, provisions that provide legal certainty to the users and the strong legal framework that they need to compete in those markets of our partners. I won't stop in the particular sectoral results. Let me just go very quickly through these slides and to point out the important elements of some of them. For instance, one of the most interesting negotiations for Mexico was the negotiation on the rules of origin. Those are the rules that tell you which regional value content you have to have in your products in order to be beneficiary of the no tariff treatment. The rule of origin for autos increased from the regional value content for automobiles, increased from 62.5 to 75. The original proposal was to increase it up to 85 or 80-something%. It was very, very high. And additionally to that, there was a proposal to have a domestic content from the US in the rule of origin. That was very strange. That was contrary to the idea of having a rule of origin for a region. So we were able to eliminate that idea and to exchange that for a new concept that is called the labor value content. What is that? And you can see that in the slide. That is from the value of the car, 40% of that value, of those parts of the car, have to be produced in an area that pays, as an average, $16 per hour. In other words, in the current situation of Mexico's average wages, that means that 40% of the car parts have to be produced in Canada or in the US, basically. No? Throughout the time, we may see that the difference, and there are a lot of questions how to measure that. If you're going to measure only those persons in the assembly line, or you're going to measure also the wage of the general manager or the specialists. I mean, there are a lot of questions how to operationalize this rule, but it was very complicated. At the end of the day, I think it's important to mention that we were always consulting the 6 car makers established in Mexico, and 4 of them were already complying with the new rule of origin. So that provided us some comfort in accepting this new proposal from the US. And also one additional car maker told us that could be complying with the new rule of origin in 18 months. No? So we had just one car maker, very recent, recently established in Mexico, that was not complying and will need to adjust its own supply chains. So that was a very complicated negotiation. Trading services is my favorite topic because I was negotiator of trading services for many years. I negotiated in the USMCA the chapter on cross-border trading services, the chapter on investment, energy, and the chapter on temporary entry of business people. And I think there is an enormous potential in trading services that we're not exploiting any of perhaps Mexico less than any of the other two partners. We need to have, and I think the USMCA have stronger rules on trading services that are competitive with respect to other regions of the world. I don't know how we are doing with time, but I will stop in a few more issues, and then I will go to the process. Where are we in the process? Digital trade is important, and I have heard a person, I think it was the ambassador of Canada in the US, saying that back in the NAFTA times, Apple was a fruit and Amazon was a river in South America. Now the reality is completely different. When you hear Apple and Amazon, you think of a different thing. No? So the new chapter on digital trade basically tackles three main provisions. First, free flow of data. We cannot strengthen a model of digital trade without having the certainty that data move across the borders without any limitation, basically. Of course, there are limitations regarding protection of personal data and other concerns related to national security, but in general terms, for purposes of trade, you should not limit through your legislation any flow of data related to digital trade. Secondly, we don't need to have these provisions in our internal legislations asking the providers of digital trade to establish in each one of the countries where they operate, to have facilities in each one of the countries, or to have the servers with the data of the clients in each one of the countries. That is contrary to the business model of digital trade. You basically have, in those big companies, 2 or 3 world hubs of data, very well protected, and you don't need to have, in each one of the countries where you operate, servers and essential facilities. So we are incorporating in this chapter the prohibition to have this local establishment of servers and essential facilities. And thirdly, we agreed on not imposing tariffs on digital products, basically. There are other provisions additional to those regarding cooperation in many aspects of the digital environment, but these are the main provisions related to trade. Energy was a particular story. I won't stop here because it's a very sad story. I was the negotiator at the technical level, and then there was a negotiation at the ministry level that ended up in a different result. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Just let me say that the result of the USMCA guarantees that the liberalization in the energy sector in Mexico, achieved by virtue of the energy reform, is preserved in this agreement in a very strange manner, but it's preserved at the end of the day. And that provides, again, certainty to those who are investing more than $100 billion in the Mexican economy in the energy sector. Intellectual property, many features, a very modern chapter. There are many elements of this chapter that were challenging. One of them was how we were going to treat the digital content that users of a digital platform upload as in their own accounts. We tackle also the issue of the duration of patents and the duration for biologics patents, the copyrights, extensions, and also coordination in other topics such as enforcement of practices that breach our commitments on intellectual property rights. Labor, I think it's important. It's important because Chapter 23 of Labor contains an annex for Mexico that explicitly says that the agreement is going to enter into force once Mexico enacts the pending labor legislation. Mexico presented an initiative of that law at the end of December, and we're in the discussion of the new law. Last week, it was approved by the lower chamber in Mexico, and hopefully before the end of next week, we will have a discussion in the Senate and have a new law on labor that changes dramatically the labor environment in Mexico, the labor rights of the workers, the independence and transparency of the labor unions. It's a very interesting reform, and it's in full compliance with our commitments under the USMCA. I mean, there were many cases where the commitments, the ambitious commitments of the agreement were in compliance, basically, or were running in parallel with internal reforms in Mexico, and that was useful in this case. Environmental was another case. I mean, we incorporated these provisions that were inside agreements into a formal chapter, bringing the commitments of international multilateral fora regarding environment protection. And the idea here is not to cover everything related to environment, because this is a trade agreement. The idea is to basically cover provisions related to the ability of promoting trade or investment without lowering your levels of environmental protection. That is the idea, basically, of the chapter. Dispute settlement, I already referred to this. And we can see that at the end of the day, we have these 4 priorities, and we have in the 3 countries sufficient content to create a success story and to take it to the discussion of the respective legislative bodies. Where we are now, we're in the process of ratification of the agreement. The agreement was negotiated, then it was signed November 30th in Buenos Aires, on the side of the G20 meeting there. And now we are preparing for the discussion at the US Congress, at the Canadian Parliament, and at the Mexican Senate. No? In the case of Mexico, it's only the Senate that ratifies international trade agreements. We don't foresee huge problems to pass the agreement in Mexico, the Mexican Senate, unless, and there is always a risk, unless there is a temptation to reopen the text that is already negotiated. If that happens, it's going to be very problematic, to put it in a simple manner, because you will have a lot of ideas on how to improve the agreement in Mexico, in Canada, in the US, and it's going to be a never-ending process of negotiation. We don't want that. In the case of the Canadian Parliament, they have the challenge of having a very short time to do it, because they have elections of the Prime Minister no later than the 3rd week of October. There's no specific date for that, but it has not, I mean, the last date to have elections is the 21st of October, if I'm not mistaken. So they don't have much time to discuss that in the Canadian Parliament. And in the case of the US, they have a set of rules under the TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, to discuss the agreement. One of the steps is precisely to present which legislation needs to be modified in order to comply with the agreement. That has been done. Another requirement is to have the final version of the texts, which is already, well, they're ready to be presented that way. And the third element was just presented last Thursday. It's a study from the International Trade Commission explaining what is the impact in the US economy from this new agreement. The study of the ITC shows what we expected from an agreement that is 25 years, that is following an agreement of 25 years, and that is a positive impact, modest positive impact in GDP, in jobs, in exports and imports from the US, basically. That's a very quick summary of 300 pages of the study. So that's the result. We believe that there is a good chance to have a discussion of this agreement before the August recess. If that doesn't happen in the US, then the discussion, the elections next year in the US will start playing a role in this discussion. And we don't want to have that discussion mixed with the political discussion of the elections. So we need to hurry up and have this discussion the sooner the better. We have to solve a very important issue, which is a bilateral issue between Mexico and the US and between Canada and the US, which is the decision of the US to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum under a Section 232 of a US law that is used only for the purposes of protecting the US from national security concerns. So we don't see how the exports of steel from Mexico are a threat to national security in the US. So we have said that. We don't believe that we should have those tariffs in place. We have imposed retaliatory tariffs to the US for an equivalent measure, for an equivalent amount, and we expect to solve that before the discussion in the US Congress in order to have a successful discussion also in Mexico. So I will leave it that way. I don't want to take much of your time, and I would like to hear your views on this. These are my contact details, and thank you very much for your attention.
Indeed, it is very complex to synthesize 300 pages in about 20 minutes. Congratulations. I was listening to your presentation, and I was able to notice the difference between the agreement in 1994 and the agreement that we have now. For instance, now we have new chapters. Now we have a pillar that implies opportunities for the 21st century. What are the major differences between something that was produced and signed 25 years ago and what we have now?
Basically, there are many differences, not only in terms of the content.
Maybe you need to turn it on.
You hear me now? Yeah, great. So there are many differences, not only in terms of the content that I was already explaining. We have more chapters, modern chapters in some other cases. That was an important modernization exercise that is very useful. But also the negotiation was very different in other aspects. I mean, first of all, the objectives of the negotiation for the three countries was different. I already said that. Secondly, the pace of the negotiation was very different. We started with rounds, as we know them. That is, we have 34 chapters. We have 30-something negotiating groups. That was the round idea. Then, after a number of rounds, we were not making any progress in those poison pills, and we decided to change to a continuous negotiation in Washington, only for some groups, trying to make progress in some of the most contentious groups. That started not working again after a number of weeks of very intense negotiations, and we ended up with negotiations at the ministerial level with bilateral negotiations, first Mexico-US, and then Canada-US. So this is very unique of this negotiation. Normally, ministers get involved in a negotiation of a free trade agreement at the very end of the process. In this case, ministers were involved in all the rounds, in the continuous negotiation in Washington, D.C., and of course, with a lot of topics in the last part of the negotiation, the bilateral ministerial negotiation. That is very complicated because normally ministers have a lot of other issues in mind. You should give them 3 or 4 elements to make the final agreement, and in this case they had 20 pending issues in their hands. It was very complicated and very different in that sense. And finally, I think it's also very different in terms of what is the perception of trade today and what was the perception of trade at that time. Now we're living in a very different environment with respect to free trade, not only in the region but also, globally speaking, and that makes it very difficult to make the case of free trade in some of the most sensitive regions of the three countries. There are many voices saying that free trade is not a solution but a problem, no? To achieve the growth objectives. And I think that is also important to mention.
We actually see that the notion of trade has changed, the understanding of trade has changed in the last 25 years. Now we have Brexit. Now we have a redesign of the NAFTA agreement. Now we have additional processes concerning the environment. Based on your close interaction with all the negotiators, what were the major challenges that the three committees faced in redesigning the agreement? Just one thing. After this question, please feel free to ask questions directly to Mr. Malpica.
No, definitely. Your questions are more than welcome. For Mexico, I think if I have to mention 2 of the main of the most contentious issues, I would say rules of origin for autos, because the trade that we have in that sector is very important for the relation. We are also, due to our network of agreements, we have an important participation in the global value chains, not only in the regional value chain. So we needed to preserve that participation with Japan, that participation with Europe. And by negotiating a very strict rule of origin in NAFTA, we run the risk of having a problem in those other regions. So it was very challenging. And I would mention also the sunset clause. That was a proposal from the US to kill the agreement every 5 years. So every 5 years, it's like getting married only for 5 years. No? So that was very problematic because many investments, of course, are longer than 5 years. And at the end of the negotiation, we were able to negotiate a time period that is longer than 5 years, it's 16 years. But additionally to that, we have a review in year 5. And if you agree on the review on year 5, you extend the life of the agreement for other 16 years. If you don't agree, you have 11 opportunities to agree. So you have to negotiate on year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 until 16. And it's almost impossible. I cannot imagine a scenario where you negotiate 11 consecutive years, only at the WTO, but for 11 consecutive years without getting an agreement. So in other words, it doesn't have a time limit in practical terms. No? So that was for Mexico. For Canada, I would mention the cultural exception. Quebec has a very strong concern on keeping culture outside of the scope of the trade agreements. The dairy access for the Canadian market, which is a very protective policy from Canada, protectionist policy from Canada, and the preservation of the chapter on trade remedies, dispute settlement. And for the US, I think the objective and the most contentious issue was to keep the sunset clause. I mean, the sunset clause, that provision that to kill the agreement every 5 years, was mentioned during the entire negotiation as a deal breaker. So they needed to have that during the entire negotiation, and they needed to get rid of the chapter on investment. So at the end of the day, I think it was partly an important result that we were able to keep the investment part of the investment chapter, and that we were able to negotiate a better, we don't call it sunset clause, we can call it sunrise clause because it's always green. But I would mention those topics.
It is really interesting to see and to hear from you that in 1994, 1993, apple was a fruit and the Amazon was a river and a jungle in Brazil. Before I have the last question, any impressions or any questions from the audience that you would like to? Yeah, there is one right there. But you need to speak in Japanese, please.
You mentioned something that there was kind of like a misunderstanding when it comes to the energy sector. Yeah, what happened about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I really wanted to explain that, although I said that I didn't. But let me explain the situation. We were coming in Mexico from an energy reform that was basically opening the sector to foreign participation after many, many years of being almost a taboo in Mexico for political reasons and historical reasons. And so we were able to capture that liberalization in TPP for the first time in all our FTAs. And in the negotiating group of energy that I was leading by Mexico, we were able to do the same in the technical negotiation, that is the negotiation at the negotiating level. No? You have 3 levels of negotiation. You have the technical level, you have these negotiating tables of 30-something topics. Then you have the CN level, we call it, the chief negotiators level, which are 3 people, no? 1 of each country, supervising the development of the negotiating groups at the technical level. And then you have the ministerial level. So we agreed on a chapter that was modernizing the view of energy at the technical level. We had a very interesting chapter, basically bringing the perspective of of a regional energy policy, it was a good exercise of incorporating Mexico to the view of the United States and Canada in the original Chapter 6 of NAFTA. And once we had a transition of administration in Mexico, the main concern of the new administration was to be very clear that the property of the hydrocarbons in Mexico is of the Mexican state, no matter what you have done in terms of liberalization. And that is true, that is in the Constitution, and that is still in the Constitution after the energy reform. But that was not the purpose of a trade negotiation. So if you see Chapter 8 of the USMCA, you will see like a political statement that says Mexico reserves the right to preserve its sovereign property of hydrocarbons. That doesn't say anything but a repetition of the Constitution. So where is this legal certainty for the investors in Mexico in oil and gas and electricity? It's hidden in a provision in the General Exceptions chapter that basically says, okay, you can regulate, you can change your constitution, and you can regulate. That is normal in any country, as long as you are not in a breach of other free trade agreements that have commitments in energy. So that it's a very obscure reference to the CPTPP, where we were able to keep the liberalization of energy. No, I would prefer a more open way to say, okay, we're going to guarantee to those investors their investments in Mexico. But the political situation was very complicated, and at the end of the day, if you read the agreement, you will see, oh well, it doesn't say anything, no, the chapter 8. So that was the story.
Any other question back here, please?
I'm concerned about the new government in Mexico City being a little bit different from what we've had traditionally in Los Pinos. It's a leftist government. It's a new government. It's a Morena government, and I'm wondering what this means as far as relations with Cuba, relations with Venezuela, taking Mexico in a very different, perhaps more radical direction in regards to international business and trade.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think the new administration has two priorities. One is to fight corruption. The other is to eliminate poverty. It is not. I mean, the trade policy is not part of the priorities of the new administration. But a good thing about this is that they don't oppose to continue with the trade policy that Mexico has had in the past. It's simply not the main priority of the new administration. So in other words, we have Secretary Marquez, from the Secretary of Economy, and Undersecretary de la Mora, the one that is responsible for trade, engaging in the same type of negotiations that we were engaged before. So we're doing all the negotiations that I showed you, and that were part of the previous administration. And we're even thinking of having another FTA with Ecuador. No? We will see how that develops. But so, I'm sorry? Yeah, I mean, the position of the new administration with respect to the U.S. is that we are neighbors, and the relation with the U.S. will be longer than this administration in the U.S. and this administration in Mexico. So we need to find ways to coexist. And a good feature of the negotiation of the USMCA was that at the end of the process of negotiation, when we had already a transition team in Mexico, part of the transition team was taking part of the negotiation. So they were at the negotiating table learning what was negotiated. And that is useful because they somehow cannot claim that they didn't know the results. No, they own the results of the negotiation because they were there. No, so that and there is a commitment, and that is an explicit commitment of the new president of Mexico, President López Obrador, to ratify the agreement. That is also positive. No, I mean, it's not his priority, but he wants to get rid of this as soon as possible to ratify, conclude his commitment, and to move forward in the other projects that he has. So in terms of trade, I see that we are not going to have a different policy. Perhaps it's not going to be at the top of the priorities.
We have time for one more question. Right here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. On the automobile slide, you were mentioning that 40% of the labor has to be produced by labor being produced at being paid $16 per hour. That's a goal. What is it currently right now? What percentage of automobiles is being paid that level right now? Do you know?
Well, the average of wages in Mexico is much lower than $16 per hour. I knew the figure, but I don't remember now. It's much lower than that. I mean, the current situation is that in the automotive sector or in any other sector, we don't pay, as an average in Mexico, $16 per hour. So the idea comes as a result of an initial proposal to determine by, like a mandate, what was going to be the level of wages in the three countries. And that is not possible if you are talking about free trade or movement of factors. No? We believe in the movement of factors and that the wages adjust, especially if you have a labor reform that creates more flexibilities in the labor markets. So you can have these movements of wages throughout the time. You cannot say by decree, wages in Mexico will be $16 per hour tomorrow. No, you cannot say that because you will create inflation and you will have a problem. So that was a part of the original ideas floating in the negotiation, to have a specific provision saying that wages should be higher in Mexico. So we didn't agree on that. What we agreed was on the rule of origin for cars. And of course, that means today that Mexico only can participate in the production of 60% of that value content, no? Because 40% is going to be produced in Canada or the US. But the fact is that the current number of the regional value content for Mexico is lower than 60%. So we still have margin to grow in that participation of the value chain of cars. So we're okay in that regard.
Thank you.
Before I actually ask the last question, now we are witnessing the emergence of a new business model for North American integration. Elements of this new business model for integration imply regional competitiveness, what we have here on the screens, certainty in trade and investment, inclusive and responsible trade, and opportunities for the 21st century. But now we have new dynamics, such as unexpected migration, such as new levels of crime. 10 years into the future, let's say year 2025, how do you imagine or envision this agreement? Just 2 or 3 bullet points. You're kind of...
I will use my magic, my crystal. I think, and as a negotiator, we always have an ideal negotiation in mind. So I have a lot of things where I would like to improve the agreement, a lot of elements, a lot of opportunities for improvement. We have the opportunity to do that in the review of the agreement, 6 years after the entry into force of the agreement. So in 10 years, probably we will have already concluded the first review and correct or improve some of the provisions that were not really optimal. And there is no optimal negotiation. There is only a possible negotiation. But we may have that opportunity in 10 years to start correcting the path. We don't see, it depends on the chapter, but we don't see overall the USMCA negotiation as a model of negotiation. I mean, we believe that there are elements that we don't especially like, and we would like to see improved. But in 10 years, we may have that opportunity to have a different story here. So I will use that, for instance, to be more ambitious on the issue of mobility, which is a pending issue in the agreement, and in general in trade agreements. I will use that to work on better protection clauses for investments, and I will use that to test how these new provisions on digital trade are working or obstructing the growth of digital trade, just to mention 3 examples.
Many things are happening. For instance, the investment of Mexican companies in the United States is actually bigger than the GDP of Uruguay as we speak now. Many dynamics will emerge. And hopefully we're going to be here to enrich and enhance the current level of integration that we have in North America. Thank you, Mr. Malpica. We are really happy to listen to you, your ideas and your impressions. And we really look forward to seeing you all here in additional events of this nature. We have a little token of appreciation for Guillermo Malpica, Dr. Diamond, Director of the Aller Center. Thank you very much.
Just something I remember.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Eileen Daspro for organizing the invitation to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, it is an aluminum block inside. No, I'm just kidding. Now we are all invited to enjoy a cocktail reception at the lobby of this building. Thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the evening.